Boa tarde. Vou primeiro falar em português, só para dar aqui nas palavras de louvor à iniciativa, às organizadoras, Alice, Marta e Mafalda, são as três, as grandes organizadoras, certo? Parabéns por este evento, a arte do Gesso, The Art of Plaster. Enfim, parece bastante alargado naquilo que são as utilidades do gesso, as suas dimensões pedagógicas, a importância nas academias, nas escolas e escolas de arte, hoje em geral faculdades, a importância na história da arte, na história da escultura, também numa história do design e a partir daí sempre aplicadas na ideia de belas artes, depois todas as implicações no âmbito florestal, no âmbito da museologia, no âmbito patrimonial, para aquisições que, por aquilo que tive a ver e por aquilo que também pelos resumos pude observar, me parece extremamente rico. Bom, e depois destas palavras vou passar à apresentação. After these initial words in Portuguese, my mother language, I'm sorry. I love my mother. Now I try to do my job in English and make all the 4 presentations. Yes. Yes. The first is André Afonso. Well, I'm not translating because the curriculum is in Portuguese, okay? Assistente das coleções de livraria e joalharia do Museu Nacional de Arte Antiga, investigador colaborador do CIEBA, André Francisco Holanda, sim. Tem centrado o seu trabalho nos estudos de livraria, metais e galvanoplastia, e as suas investigações mais recentes relacionam-se com as coleções de reproduções históricas que integram o acervo do Museu Nacional de Arte Antiga, nomeadamente as coleções de galvanoplastias e de fictile ivories. Okay. E a apresentação chama-se Aplicação do Bélico ao Belo, Novos contributos sobre uma coleção de reproduções em gesso de peças de armaria. Que André pensa que vai ser em português, inglês? Inglês.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organization of this Congress and also to thank to all the colleagues that are here and all the colleagues that are online with us. So I will start my lecture that I entitled From War to Beauty, New Contributions on a Plaster Cast Collection of Armory Pieces that belongs to this faculty. So today I came to talk with you about the study that I've been dedicating to a small collection of 10 objects in the collection of the Faculty of Fine Arts of the University of Lisbon, which is a set of objects that reproduce mostly pieces of armory. In fact, I can even say that the beginning of this study came about by chance. I already knew these objects when I had once visited the faculty's collection storage, but I also knew that there was little information and documentation associated with them, namely when they were made and incorporated, who manufactured these objects, as well as their historical path from the late 19th century to the present day. Almost by chance, the identification of archival documentation where the purchase of these objects refers to give rise to this study. We still have many unanswered questions, but it seems to me that we were able to contribute to understanding these objects a little bit better and documenting their path. The beginning of this whole process took place when I read some minutes of the meetings of the board of the directors of the Academy of Fine Arts of Lisbon. In the minutes of the meeting of February 19, 1884, we can read the following. The director of the School of Fine Arts here, stated that he had called the board of directors to meet him to present the proposal of a foreign formatore to purchase of a certain number of plaster casts of different pieces of armor belonging to the Royal Armoury of Madrid, such as shields, helmets, breastplates, etc. The samples that were presented to us were shields and helmets made in plaster. A month later, at the meeting on March 17, 1884, the happy outcome of this process was already announced, as we can read. Mr. Simões de Almeida informs the council that, having proceeded together with Mr. Bastos, they were professors here, to choose the plaster reproductions of armory pieces, 20 were finally purchased for the total price of 40,000 cash. Here, the first element to retain, that the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of Lisbon purchased from a foreign formatore in 1884 a collection of 20 plaster casts that reproduced armory pieces from the Royal Armoury of Madrid. The first question that arises is that if 20 pieces were purchased and currently there are only 10, where are the remaining 10? So this is the collection. As we can see, 10 pieces, 10 reproductions of helmets and shields, mostly. So, in this second topic, I will talk about this issue, from war to beauty, reproductions of armory as ornamental models. The issue of the Royal Armoury of Madrid and the reproduction of armory objects take us back to the 19th century and to the importance that these objects had as artistic and ornamental models in the fields of artistic and design education, and the role they played in the schools of fine arts and applied arts and museums of ornamental arts. First of all, it is important to remember the importance that the reproductions of works of art had throughout the 19th century, especially in the context of the practices of the Museum of Ornamental Arts, Applied Arts, or Industrial Arts, and we will focus mainly on this universe of museums. Although this Congress is mainly dedicated to the issue of plaster, which includes plaster casts, obviously, we can say that in a generic perspective, the triad plaster casts, electrotypes, or galvanoplastias, and photography played together a fundamental role in this amazing 19th century. In fact, the main objective of this typology of museums, especially from the mid-19th century and with the Victorian Albert Museum as model, was to disseminate good taste, beauty, good design, and good ornaments, helping in the visual education of artists, artisans, and designers who were involved in the creation and production of design and industrial art objects, as well as in the education of the general public as consumers of these objects. Ultimately, the intention was to improve the taste of the entire nation and qualify the national artistic industries. As the first director of the Victorian Albert Museum said, André Afonso, one of the central goals of this museum was to transform the taste of the whole nation. Regarding reproductions, obviously that the famous convention for promoting universally reproductions of works of art for the benefits of museums of all countries, it's complicated to say this entire sentence, that was designed by Cole and signed in 1867 in the Universal Exhibition of Paris, had an important role in the dissemination of some museum practices and in the exchange of reproductions between museums. Returning to the subject of armory reproductions, throughout the 19th century, collections of original armory objects were assumed as an important visual and artistic repertory, with the 16th century armory standing out as a glossary of art and ornaments from the Renaissance and from the late Renaissance. What is the fact is that we are going to observe the existence of reproductions of this type of objects, either in plaster or in photography or in electrotyping. The electrotyping process have perhaps a special use and interest. This electrochemical process, which emerged in the decade of 1830s, made it possible to create metal reproductions of objects from the arts of silverware and metal. So, and since it emulated or imitated better the material of the original armory objects, usually made in metal, it played an important and preferential role in its reproduction. Some of the world's leading manufacturers of electrotypes have armory electrotypes reproductions in their sales catalogs, namely shields, helmets, and breastplates, such as the British manufacturers Elkington and Company and Frank and Son, as we can see in these pictures, but also the company Christoffel and Company from Paris, or the company Karl Haas in Vienna. The last company from Karl Haas in Vienna has a special relationship with the Academy of Fine Arts of Lisbon, since in 1875, this academy purchased a large set of more than 70 electrotypes that were most likely produced by Karl Haas. It included 6 reproductions of armory, including these helmets, these shields, and this pistol. If the Academy of Fine Arts bought these electrotypes of armory in 1875, as well as in 1884, the plaster casts that we are studying, the Academy also bought an important photographic album with photographs by the famous French photographer based in Spain, Jean Laurent, in 1880. It is a large photographic album. It is a large photographic album with 100 albumin prints representing objects from the Royal Armoury of Madrid. So it has a closer relationship with the plaster cast collection under study. And why the Royal Armoury of Madrid? In fact, this is one of the most important armoury collections in the world, representing examples of the best European armoury production, namely the Negroli family from Milan, Italy, or the Herrenschmidt family from Germany. So its reproductions, mainly by plastic cast or also in photography, and its dissemination was very important throughout the 19th century. A while ago, I spoke to you about the triad, plaster casts, electrotypes, and photographs, and how these 3 processes have an intense connection in the 19th century. And it's very interesting to notice how the Lisbon Academy of Fine Arts acquired from 1875 to 1884 reproductions of armory throughout these 3 different processes of reproduction. As a summary of what I said so far, I hope I have managed to clarify these ideas. In 1884, 20 plaster casts of armory pieces were purchased by the Academy of Fine Arts of Lisbon, and currently only 10 reproductions exist in the Faculty of Fine Arts collection. Now I will try to trace the path of this collection to the present day. When the collection was purchased in March 1884, the opening of the National Museum of Fine Arts and Archaeology in Lisbon was imminent. The museum was managed by the Academy of Fine Arts, and it was officially opened in June 1884. We cannot tell if this collection of plaster casts was initially used for teaching at the school here, or if it was immediately transferred to the museum. What is a fact is that almost of all of these 20 objects can be identified in 2 photographs of the museum from around 1900, as we can see in these pictures. However, at the beginning of the 19th century, the age of reproductions was coming to an end, and the role they played in museums and art education in the 9th century would soon disappear. In the case of the National Museum of Fine Arts and Archaeology in Lisbon, this museum was transformed in 1911 in the context of the new legislation of the young Portuguese Republic, giving rise to the National Museum of Ancient Arts and to the National Museum of Contemporary Arts. The vast majority of the collection of artistic reproductions in plaster and electrotypes were in charge of the Museum of Ancient Art, which around 1950 would begin to transfer these collections of plaster from exhibition galleries to museum storage, and also the electrotypes. In a second moment, from the decades of 40s and 50s, the vast majority of the plaster casts collection, including hundreds of objects, would end up being permanently transferred to other institutions. Regarding the documentation, reading documentation of these processes, we quickly understood that plaster casts were usually large objects that occupied a lot of space in the museum storage. So it was urgent to give them another destination and leave the museum's storage free. In this context, in 1944, around 200 plaster casts were transferred to the Museum of Comparative Sculpture, which opened some years later. In 1951, around 100 objects were transferred from the museum to the School of Fine Arts of Lisbon, currently the Faculty of Fine Arts. It is therefore in this context that the 20 plaster casts that we are studying are in the collection of this school. Not the 20, but only 10, we see. Regarding this transfer of the museum to the school, we were able to identify a registered book with information about works of art from the museum's collection that had been loaned or transferred to other institutions. This book also has photographs of these objects. This written and photographic documentation allows us to conclude that in 1951, the collection was still made up of 20 objects. So it must have been from that date that the 10 objects currently with unknown whereabouts were separated from the rest of the collection. These photographs from 1951, together with the photographs from 1900s that I have previously showed, also allow us to understand what the currently non-existent objects were like, achieving a kind of reconstitution of the original collection. So we can see some pieces here. And what collection is this? As I mentioned, the 10 remaining objects reproduce, for the most part, objects from the Royal Armoury of Madrid, namely helmets and shields, as we can see in these examples. However, there are three different cases. Just a moment. There are three different cases, such as this one, which reproduce the famous Cellini shield from the English Royal collections, or this one, which reproduced one of the numerous 16th or 17th century versions of the temperance basin, or this one, which reproduced a basin or dish whose original objects I could not identify. And what would the 10 objects that we currently don't know where they are look like? According to the photographs from 1900 and 1951, we were able to conclude that the totality, or almost the totality, also reproduced objects from the Royal Armoury of Madrid, as you can see in some examples that I show you here in these pictures. If we compare with the traditional collections of plastic casts existing in museums, schools and other institutions, mainly including reproductions of statues and sculptures, architectural or ornamental elements, we clearly come to the conclusion that it is very uncommon to find reproductions of armory in plaster. However, the most interesting cases that we have identified, and which are particularly related to the Lisbon collection, are to be found in the National Museum of Sculpture of Spain in Valladolid, and in the former School of Industrial Arts in Geneva, Switzerland. In the Spanish Museum, it is interesting. It is an interesting collection of almost 50 plaster reproductions of armory pieces, reproducing, for the most part, objects from the Royal Armoury of Madrid. Regarding, as we can see in these objects from the National Museum of Sculpture in Spain. Regarding these plaster casts, the Spanish Museum knows that they were purchased from two different formatores, namely a man called Kreitmayr in 1886, probably the German formatore Josef Kreitmayr,
and Lucas Bartolozzi in 1894, certainly an Italian formatore. Many of these reproductions find parallels with the Lisbon collection. That is, they reproduce the same objects. In the case of the School of Industrial Arts in Geneva, Switzerland, a catalogue of moldings that its plaster cast workshop produced and sold from 1892 shows a large number of reproductions of the Royal Armory of Madrid, with a large number of objects very similar to the Lisbon collection. The Swiss school also had a relationship with Portugal, since an important employee of the school, Louis Gaillard, was involved in organizing industrial art education in Portugal in the 80s, and in hiring foreign teachers for Portuguese industrial schools. Regarding the Lisbon plaster cast collection, we only know that it was purchased in 1884 from a foreign formatore, but we do not know exactly who he was or who made them. Could there be any connection with the aforementioned Lucas Bartolozzi or Joseph Kreitmeier, or with the Geneva School of Industrial Arts? It is a question we leave open. And I'm also finishing. And in conclusion, this is the path that we have been able to identify so far in the relation to this collection of 10 plaster casts that belongs to the Faculty of Fine Arts of Lisbon. In the function or mission of these objects as instruments of visual teaching seems to us to be well known, whether in the scope of the activity of museums or schools of art. And even to conclude, it is quite interesting to also observe that the use of these reproductions, it is quite interesting to observe the use of this reproduction as visual models in the studios of some artists, as we can see in the case of the Spanish sculptor and goldsmith Plácido Zuloaga, where in this beautiful photograph from around 1900, we see him in his studio surrounded by plaster casts, including reproductions of the Royal Armory of Madrid. But that would be a topic for another talk. Thank you very much.